right. Well, hi, everybody. I'm excited to join the meeting. I've been meaning to come to one of your group meetings for a long time. My name's Margaret Pommert, and I love catamarans. I love multihulls. I used to live in Southern California and was part of a community sailing program that had an F-27 trimaran down there. And I love that, but I'll be honest, I'm the sort of person who, I love trimarans in Southern California. Up here, I've outgrown my dry suit. I used to have a dry suit. I'm too big for the dry suit. I'm not ready to buy another dry suit. And so I kind of gravitate towards the cruising catamarans up here. But I think it's awesome that you all sail trimarans on the Salish Sea year round. By way of background, sorry, I hope that video, hey, stop video, stop. We're all watching the wind channel go round and round. By way of background, I am a volunteer who spends a lot of time working with different groups on recreational boating safety. Right now, my gray hair is from the fact that I'm the organizer for the U.S. Sailing International Offshore Safety at Sea with Hands-on Training that is normally done once a year in the Pacific Northwest. We didn't do it last year because of COVID. We're scheduled to do it February 13th, Sunday, and I'm pulling my hair out because I had 300 people who wanted 80 seats. So from one hand, I've got that pressure, and then from the other side, I know with COVID coming and everything, many of the other safety at sea programs are being canceled. It's a little stressful, but I really am a strong supporter of hands-on training when it comes to safety, high quality hands-on training, which that delivers. So I do that as I'm the VP for Safety at Sea from the Sailing Foundation, which is a nonprofit based here in the Pacific Northwest. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year, so we're a long time Pacific Northwest based nonprofit, and our mission is to promote boating in the Pacific Northwest, and we do that two ways. We have a youth sailing director who is our only employee, and what he does is support all the youth sailing programs in the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, high school, college programs. He does that because we realize we've got to kind of grow the next generation of sailors. And then the second part of our charter is Safety at Sea. And the Sailing Foundation developed the Life Sling, which hopefully many of you are familiar with some years ago. And part of our charter is to promote its use. As in the role that I have with Safety at Sea, I'm also part of the U.S. Sailing Safety at Sea Committee, and that committee is doing research, constantly on new procedures, new techniques. And so they reached out to me last year because there's a new / alternative, maybe less known technique for crew overboard recovery called the Midline Lift that they wanted us to get involved in doing research on. And so part of the reason I'm here this evening is to talk to you all about that, see if you think, and I'll just describe the procedure a little bit, see if it's something that any of you might be interested in participating on the research on. And so the big picture of what am I hoping to accomplish this evening? Really, what I'm hoping to accomplish this evening is you all sitting in the room are really experts in this topic. I'm not, especially it seems like many of you are trimaran sailors, and when it comes to how are these things done, what are the risks of crew overboard? How do you rescue a crew overboard from a trimaran? I hope that we can have some fruitful discussions. I was hoping we could talk about both trimarans and catamarans. I put in cruising or beach catamarans here because I really honestly don't know your organization that well. I have the impression that the majority of you are trimaran sailors, but I don't know how that breaks down. And I think the second group is cruising catamaran sailors, but I didn't know. Maybe you have beach catamaran sailors among you as well. And so rather than tell you all, teach you all about a topic that you could probably teach me on, what I'd initially like to start off was just some discussion topics about these. And then later on, there were some questions that were sent in ahead of time. And I do teach on cruising catamarans and have some experience with cruising catamarans and opinions on crew overboard rescue from a cruising catamaran, but much less from a trimaran. So, does that sound acceptable to people to have this discussion this way?
That sounds great, Margaret.
Excellent. Okay. Well, so first of all, with that first discussion topics, let's start with the trimaran sailors in there. How many trimaran sailors are there among you all? Yeah, the majority. So have any of you ever experienced a crew overboard from a trimaran, either as the person who went overboard or the mortified skipper left back on board?
My problem is I would be both. I would not be left back on board as I'm always single-handing. I'd be the mortified skipper watching my boats do a horizon job on me.
Well, I do have, I'd be interested to talk about how you lay out your jack lines and what you do with your tether things.
I think I have, and the reason why I'm a little interested in this is because all my overboard experience has been pretty casual. So, we're out with the family and hanging out. We lose a couple kids, we lose a couple dogs. And, really in those kind of environments, it's not really a big deal. I mean, you're out there, you're not really outside of age. You just, they fall in front of the boat, you go to the back of the boat, you grab them as you go by. So, or you stop and you turn around, and it's not a very life-threatening kind of situation. The things that I'm a little more concerned about is when the conditions are not benign, because my feeling is that you can pretty much do anything you want if the weather is say 5 to 10 knots or below, but when it gets above that, that's when I think really I feel that I could probably use some info.
Sense.
It wasn't necessarily a crew overboard, but we did come across a kayaker that had overturned once, and he was trying to swim his boat back to shore and was getting drawn farther from the current. So we ended up picking him up. So it kind of a crew overboard thing. It just wasn't one of our people. Sure.
That's interesting. One of the other things that I do related to safety at sea is I'm the chair of the U.S. Sailing's Hanson Rescue Medal, which is a medal given to someone who's saved someone's life at sea. It's given to recreational boaters in the U.S. And the last medal that we just awarded was actually to the crew of a couple beach catamarans. They were in a race, and somebody had hopped in a kayak to come out and watch the race, and his kayak sank underneath him. And so the two beach catamarans came to his rescue, saved the guy. But it was interesting. The first catamaran that got there was an ACAT. It's a small single-handed one, and he intentionally decided to kind of stand off, afraid, because he was concerned that in dragging this kayaker on board, that his own catamaran might capsize. So he waited until a double-handed catamaran came in to haul the guy in. So yeah, there might not be somebody off of your own boat.
So I had a similar kind of situation where we're up in BC, and we saw a bunch of boats looking around. We were trying to figure out what was going on. Turned out they were looking for a guy who had gone overboard, and we found him in the water. He was largely unclothed and pretty weak. So and the conditions were light. We were motoring, if I recall. No, wait a minute. Motoring? No, we were under sail. And we stopped and first tried to get him on board. We didn't use our life sling. We had one. Oh, wait a minute. Let me think. We tried to pull the guy up. I think it was using a life sling, and he wasn't strong enough. His arms weren't strong enough to hold down. And he was, he was kind of slippery, sort of like a big greased pig. You can't grab him. And he was a heavy guy. And we couldn't get him aboard. So we gave him we radioed these other people who were looking for him and said, hey, we got this guy. And gave him a life jacket and tried to keep him, stay with him and keep him afloat until somebody else showed up who could, it was a great big motorboat with one of those patios on the back, so you can just stand on and haul the guy up. But it scared the living daylights out of me because it was so clear that it's really hard to get people on board. And one of the things that occurred to me is I want everybody on my boat to have basically something I can just clip in and hoist their asses out of the water, without them needing to be strong enough to kind of hold themselves into some kind of sling. So in our racing crew situation, I've been devoting a fair amount of thought to trying to figure out PFDs that have, and get everybody into a PFD that has a good ring on the front where you can just clip it in and then hoist them up. And that the PFD should have a sufficiently strong crotch strap to not only keep it from going over their head, but take the full weight of the person when you're hoisting them out of the water. And so I've been, fooling around with modifying PFDs and stuff to try to figure out how to do that. That's my experience. It's pretty scary, really, because you realize, man,
yeah,
this guy was just not able to help at all. I mean, we've gotten up in the boat plenty of times when you're, in the marine or whatever, and you dive off the back and then just haul yourself up on the back. We got a little bar there, but if you're weak, you can't, your arms just aren't strong enough to pull yourself into the boat. Or if you're heavy and, whatever, heavy and weak.
Yeah, and if you've been in the cold water for a while, doesn't matter.
Yeah, don't take long.
Yeah, you might have been strong when you went in. So I'm curious, when you used the life sling, was the life sling actually around him? It was underneath his arms?
I think so, if I'm remembering right.
And was that led to a halyard to lift him up, or were you just kind of trying to drag him up over the transom?
We were trying to drag his ass up because we didn't have enough time to kind of rig a halyard and stuff, or we didn't think to rig a halyard. We never practiced on this thing. So yeah, we had him in a life sling. We basically drag him up over the side of the float, which is where the freeboard is lowest.
Yeah.
And that didn't work at all. And we're trying to keep him away from the motor, right? Because you can't drag him up over the back if you got the motor going and you got, the propeller there. But yeah, that was the problem. And there was because he didn't have any clothes on, he was so slippery.
Mm-hmm.
Why he didn't have any clothes on is a whole nother story, which we never found the answer to.
Yeah. So, and this was on your trimaran?
Yeah. So
that's one thing that I've never done research with a live person, or but I could do it with a dummy, because it's one of those things. If you're trying to drag a body, a living human, over the edge of most any boat, not only is there the extra drag of trying to drag somebody over a corner, but not to mention the pain and injury that you're likely to cause. I don't know how doesn't seem like it's very successful with most anybody, but
yeah. Yeah, we were basically kind of floundering around. We didn't have a good plan.
So Vince, my practicing, if you go over to the practice on that, just put a webbing in a figure 8 around a person's shoulder, around their back, clip them in on the front. So you're basically lifting them up from the shoulders. And then we just put a 8-to-1 off the back of the boom. I just lifted the person up from the back of the boom to the boat. It was just, using a boom bag, an 8-to-1 boom bag. And
What did you do with the
6 foot, 8 foot, piece of webbing strap?
How did you rig this webbing strap again?
It's just it's a loop. And all I do is put in a figure 8. You put one arm through each one, goes around their back, goes around their shoulders. You got clip them right on the front.
It's like
Lifts them up from the shoulders.
Yeah, so I talked to the Seattle Harbor Patrol about what they do for recovery, and they described that same 8 to 10 foot webbing loop and put it around somebody. They did mention that they usually use it for body recovery because they mentioned
just tie that loop, put a webbing, put it around their shoulders. It goes underneath their shoulders. You got a thing right in the front to clip on, and then just use the boom bag and get 8-to-1 lift.
So again,
You can pull people, and I just do it off the. I've never. Well, I got a scary story to tell about Chicago Mac race, but in the Puget Sound, I've played around with that in the Puget Sound. And, it's had pretty easy success with it.
how,
So,
Hey,
Todd,
Todd,
the question I have for you, based on what the Seattle Harbor Patrol described, is they said they use it for body recovery, and they mentioned it was extraordinarily painful to use on a live human being, that it was akin to torture. What was your experience when you were in that loop, being lifted up, that webbing loop?
It's not comfortable, but back to your point, it gets you out of the water. It's not, I wouldn't call it excruciatingly painful. And back to your point, if you got some strength, you get lifted up, you put your feet up, you take some weight off, and you're out of the water.
That's good feedback. Thank you, because I don't know anybody who'd actually was doing had actually had that done to them, and I was wondering.
It's not hard to it's not hard to practice.
Hey, Todd, this goes for the life sling as well. Anytime you're trying to hoist somebody out using the boom, you were on an F-27 at the time?
Right.
Did you try to hoist them over the back beam? Is that what?
Yeah, exactly. So to put right off the back of the boom, and go in between the AMA and the main hull. Right,
yeah, I'm trying to think whether my boom extends far enough to do that.
some other questions. How windy was it? Did you have to drop the main? I mean, the interesting thing that.
So I'm with you, Jeff. I mean, if you're moving and all that, it's also just, it's a little bit more tricky. But it's in theory, you should be able to point yourself into the wind, right?
And then your boom centered, and then you can't get it out to the side. I mean, I think
traveler out or whatever. I mean, I'm with you. I mean, it's got complications for sure.
Yeah, I mean, my thought is, well, and this is going to vary from boat to boat because all our boats are extremely different, from each other. I mean, some of us have F boats, and those are all fairly similar and low freeboard, but there are other people that have pretty high freeboard boats. And as far as the F boats like yours and mine, the concern I have is that if you try and stop and rescue someone with the boom in anything over like 5 knots worth of wind, it's going to be extremely difficult because it seems like it's hard enough to keep the boat, on station in a breeze. And then you try and swing the boom out to rescue someone. I mean, I think, or at least my thought is, maybe a halyard at that point, but, and I guess I wouldn't, to the point about the figure 8, I think if I was drowning, I probably really wouldn't care if I ended up with a couple of bruises, but that's just my own viewpoint.
Most of our discussion has had to do with, so far as having to do with getting somebody out of the water up onto the boat. When my wife and I took a cold water rescue course, one of the things we learned, and Margaret can, I'm sure, speak to this if she likes, but the thing that a hypothermic person loses first is their ability to grip. And if you assume that the victim in the water cannot grip a ladder, cannot grip a line, basically they can't have the use of their hands, then that has led me to start to conceptualize an idea of using a small teak grate that I use in the head for taking a shower, and adapting that to a 4-spar Nova hoist that I can use to raise the person out of the water. So the key is to get the person from the water onto the swim deck, even if the swim deck is, 2 inches above the water and the person is getting sloshed with waves. That person is still out of the water mostly. At least the person's core is out of the water, and so the body temperature doesn't continue to fall. And then once you get them there, then you can have a little more time to hoist them aboard. The problem with using a boom is, as someone pointed out, oftentimes you need to take the sail down. Taking the mainsail down takes time, and the priority, it seems to me, has to be to get that person out of the water ASAP and not do anything other than maneuvering. So if I can get the boat close to the person and I can heave to or do something to stabilize the motion of the boat, then I can drop the grate, have a pull down system where if I'm single handing and I fall overboard, if I can keep the boat from sailing away without me, if there's enough weather helm so the boat stops, then I should be able to swim to the boat, provided I have a decent PFD on, and I can get onto a pull down swim deck that I can design. And then from there, I can recover enough feeling in my hands to climb aboard and save my life.
What kind of boat are you talking about? What kind of boat are you envisaging this on?
I have a monohull. It's called an Illyrian Express 38. And it has electric winches, but there has to be a second person on the boat. If I'm single handing, those winches don't do me any good, obviously, because no one can hoist me aboard, but they're certainly powerful enough to pick me up. And the Nova lift by 4-spar has a 220-pound lifting capacity. So that, coupled with the winch, if I'm double handing or more crew is aboard, then getting that person up on the deck is, in my case, is not going to be a big problem. If unless the person is really heavy.
Is that 220 pounds, was that a static load or dynamic load capacity? In other words, if you're in a seaway, if it's bouncing.
I honestly don't know the answer to that, but I think if someone were to go to 4-spar, they could probably give you some info on that.
And you were saying you were thinking it would probably get them up to the deck, but maybe not high enough to come over the lifelines. You're just kind of getting them out of the water at that point.
Well, that's the other thing. I have those little hypodermic needle type of, I don't know what you call them. They're little pins that operate like a hypodermic needle. And I have those on both the upper and lower lifelines on both sides of my cockpit. And they're tied off so they can't get lost. And I press the little button, I remove the pin, drop the lifelines, and now the lifelines are no longer a barrier.
Nice. Okay.
And they're very easy, they're cheap, and it's a great way to have secure lifelines when you want them, and no lifelines when they just get in the way.
Hey, I got a question for you, John. So I'm just looking at on my phone at the Nova Stern Davit set for 1-inch rails. This is 4-spar product. Is that what you're talking about? It's like you could use it for a dinghy. Could be used for dinghy.
This is a single strut, single bar with about a 15-inch horizontal extension. So it's
Oh,
enough to pick up a person, but not really a beamy dinghy.
Is it more
Um,
designed for an outboard?
No, it's really designed to pick up a person.
Oh, it is. Okay.
And I mean,
Oh,
if I'm
no,
going to pick up a
here it is.
dinghy, I'd use the boom.
Yeah.
Because
I don't know if you can-
obviously, you know, if somebody comes up to the boat in a dinghy, the chances are the mainsail is down already and I've got the boom available to swing out and pick up the person.
So tell me again the name of it. The 4-spar lift designed or intended to pick up a person is called a what?
Nova, 4-spar
Nova
is the name
Lift.
of the company, and NOVA, Nova is the name of the product that I have. And you know, to be honest, I haven't used it. I haven't figured out exactly where I want to mount it on the boat. If I mount it close enough to the cockpit so that I can use the winch and pull the person on board, then that product is going to be in the way of the boom. And if it's far enough aft to avoid the end of the boom, then it's going to be out of my reach. And so I'm trying to figure out how to set that up. The only thing I can do is perhaps tie the boom off on the other side of the boat so it can't interfere with the 4-spar product. And then I can pull the person aboard. But I put some thought into this, and I really, you know, the water in Puget Sound, as everyone knows, is really cold, and there are things that we learned in the cold water class, like a life sling or other products like that. If you throw a life sling out to a person, I know I'm getting off the subject here about pulling someone on board, but one of the most important things we learned in cold water rescue was that you don't want to try to tow a person or pull a person towards the vessel on their stomach, because more often than not, you pull their head underwater, and by the time they get to the boat, they'll be drowned. You've got to get the person to roll over on their back and with a life sling or whatever, and pull them on their back so that they can breathe air, not water, on their way to the boat.
Yeah, it depends on how fast you're pulling them through the water. I have a 19-year-old nephew, who is perfectly designed for that type of research. And so in warmer water, I found that right about at 5 knots, he would actually start to submerge if I was doing him at 5 knots behind the boat. So less than that, you as you say, still start to take water in if you pull them in more slowly.
That we lost somebody overboard on the Columbia River during a race. We had just come around the windward mark, and we had just set an 838 square foot spinnaker on a Hobie 33, and the boat suddenly started to accelerate, and one of my crew was leaning against the lifeline. He fell in the water, and he was the sheet trimmer, the spinnaker sheet trimmer. And he had that sheet wrapped around his hand a number of times. And we said, Bill, let go, let go. And he just shook his head, I'm not letting go. And so there were about 6 of us on board, and we physically pulled him up onto the boat. But we had to be careful not to pull him too fast for that same reason.
Did you jibe, and did you come back up into the wind, or?
I can't remember. It was so long ago. I can't remember if it was a bear away or a jibe set. But we couldn't be messing around with the spinnaker. We had to get him out of the water ASAP because it was cold. So we just held our course and just physically pulled him up to the boat and then onto the boat. But we had enough people on board to do that.
That Nova Lift thing looks pretty good, but I was just looking at it on my phone. I mean, it's a kind of a clever thing. It's a 2-to-1. It basically is a little bitty crane with a 2-to-1 built-in thing and a hook. But you still gotta attach the person. So that's where either that figure 8 deal comes in, or some kind of harness, something where you can grab the person with the hook.
It shows a life sling in the documentation there, actually. That Nova Lift's got a life sling attached to it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a life sling would be a good, I think, a good thing for a person to wear for hoisting purposes.
But how does a life sling work to you got to have enough strength to keep your arms down, right? For the life sling to work.
It actually, when once you're pulling on the life sling, it normally closes around a person, you know, kind of like a purse underneath their arms. Now, you know, I'm sure it, you know, it will vary. Maybe there's situations, but that's the normal thing. So when I get hoisted, I get, you know, I do this practice all the time, and when I'm hoisted up, it's not difficult because it's squeezing around my rib cage.
So that's another way to do the figure eight. And you just kind of thinking back to the mountaineering days. I never tried it in the water, but you know, I learned the figure eight from mountaineering because we wear that all the time when we go up Mount Rainier. So when you fall in the crevasse, you know, is what was going to catch you. And you put another one, you know, you put basically another one around your legs or your crotch, and you connect the two together. Now you got the legs and your shoulders all coming up together.
And tell me again, so sorry, can you describe again how you run that figure eight on the body of a person?
It's just figure eight, put an arm through each one, put it across the back, connect the front to the two loops in the front to a D ring or something, and pull it up. And so you got a line across the back. You got both arms underneath it. It's every mountaineer does it, right? It's you know, how would climb Mount Rainier when you fall in a crevasse? That was what was going to catch you.
And is it fairly snug?
Yeah.
So you have to have, and you would set it up.
It doesn't have to be super snug, but I mean, back to your comments about how bruised you want to get. I mean, the tighter you put it, the more comfortable that's going to be. So
tell me about, so let's say you got somebody in the water, you throw them this loop and say, hey, turn it into a figure eight.
Yeah,
no, not that arm. I mean, is this something?
I know. So some of that's got to, obviously you got to practice. You know, it's not hard to put on, right? But I'm with you with the instructions if you've never done it before. But I mean,
this is not something you wear.
Put a figure eight, put both arms through it. You know, come to me, put both arms. It's not real hard to put on, right? Put both arms through this figure eight. Put the crossing across your back. I'm just going to hook a loop on the front.
I'm suspecting here that every situation has kind of a different scenario. So like the one you're describing, the person is completely conscious, has function of their faculties and their extremities. And so in that situation.
I could, you know, if I could get someone to the boat, I could put that on them.
Yeah, right. So that sounds to me like kind of a mid-level crisis. Yeah. Like on my hand, when I'm fishing drunk people and kids and dogs out of the water, that's pretty low level risk. You just grab them by the scruff and pull them up over the edge. So again, it sounds like you're in conditions where, you know, you have some ability to control things.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I mean, the person has to be able to, you know, cooperative. I mean, if they're unconscious, you know, it's a whole other level, right? And
so say you don't have a designated, you know, rescue water dog that dives in and puts a harness on the person, then hops out and off on the basket. So
another thing I learned, and I learned this by talking to the Alki swimmers. Have you guys gone out there and looked at that? You know, people swim year round off of Alki Beach.
Crazy people.
And so when I lived in Alki, I'd go down there and talk to them. They sit there and say, how do you guys do this? And there's people that are swimming, you know, all the way across the sound. You know, it just blows my mind. So I was like, well, I'm going to give this a try. And basically they said to prevent hypothermia, all you got to do is keep your ears from getting cold. So they're all plugging wax in their ears and putting multiple caps over their heads. So I'm like, well, I'm going to try this. I plugged the ears, go put the caps over the head, and went out for a 45-minute swim in the Puget Sound. And you don't get hypothermia. You get cold, but you don't get hypothermia.
There are techniques. I think you're right. I mean, there's survival techniques that you take cold showers every day.
Well, this is just because you talk to them, it's all about hypothermia. They're also
your body does acclimate. So I mean, I think what you're saying is, I mean, if you are going to be out sailing, it sounds like you're saying the very first thing you want to be is prepared for the conditions. So either A, you're familiar with like swimming in cold water for 45 minutes, you know how to avoid hypothermia, or B, you're wearing a dry suit, or C, you're very careful about what you're doing and you're maybe clipped in so you don't fall off. I mean, that to me, that part requires some, you know, some thought,
Yeah,
some
preparation.
pre-action. Yeah.
Well, Jeff, you're getting ready to do Race to Alaska with, you know, 4 old guys.
Not old.
Well, elderly. And so what are you going to do? I mean, you know, this is a real deal. You're going to be sailing at night through the Gulf of whatever with 13-foot waves. I mean,
that's why I'm listening. And that's why I'm very interested, you know, and again, you know, like, you know, just using my boat is not the most difficult boat to rescue someone on. I mean, the floats are like, you know, maximum of maybe 18 inches off the water. I have pulled big guys in over the float, kids, dogs, like I said, but my basic premise is like, if, you know, I have, you know, for starters, I have in my mind two scenarios. You know, one scenario is I fall off the boat and say I'm solo or whatever. I fall off that boat in an area that has help that can get there within an hour. I'm you know, I always sail with my VHF in my pocket, and so I fall overboard. I don't care. That's, you know, if you're doing 18 knots and you fall off the boat, that boat is so far gone by the time you even come up, you know, from underwater. And I'm just going to call the Coast Guard. I'm just going to float around out there for an hour until the Coast Guard comes to pick me up and someone digs my boat off a beach somewhere. So, but, you know, the one that concerns me is the one you're talking about, which is, you know, what do I do? Really, to me, like, if you fall overboard in Puget Sound, if you're prepared and the person is not hypothermia or dying, you're pretty good. I mean, there have been some things that bad, you know, like anyone who read about what happened at race week, you know, that was probably a combination of the guy not being in great shape, big guy, gets dunked upside down, probably went into cold shock, probably inhaled a bunch of water and he drowned. So, and that was with a crew of what, 10 right there trying to get him in. But the thing that worries me is, just like you said, you're out when you're further away from help. And even if you're prepared, you know, like what is, you know, like what are the best techniques in particular in heavy air for rescuing someone? I don't know that I have an answer.
you know, Jeff, it seems to me that for Race to Alaska, are you going to do PLBs?
I think the first thing, PLBs,
Personal locator beacons.
I'm going to say no, but that's really only because of cost. I mean, if I had a bunch of, you know, money, cash laying around, I'd probably do it. They have the crew alert things. You fall in and it gives you a beep, so people who are off watch realize someone just, you know, fell overboard. I mean, there's some devices like that, and unfortunately, that's, you know, probably not an option for me. But I mean, the first thing that I think I'm going to do is kind of, you know, what Todd and I were talking about, which is, you know, I think we're going to be prepared first. So we're going to have jack lines, and, you know, when we're in situations with a merit it, I think we're going to be clipped in so we don't come off the boat. Now, I think that's in my boat, since it flips, not like a monohull. You know, that rule may change if things are getting to the point where we think we might flip, because I think if you flip, you're probably better off not being clipped underneath the boat. So I think it's a, you know, for us, preliminary plan is starting to look like kind of a sequential or kind of situational specific kind of approach. If I dread, you know, someone, you know, 2 up, 2 down, you know, 2 people asleep, the one person, you know, who's on watch falls off, and that essentially leaves, you know, a single-handed person trying to find someone in the dark. Now, we do have a plan where everybody has the VHF, and we've talked to each other about that, because, you know, when you fall off the boat at night, chances are you're not going to see where the person is. if you have two-way communication with the person, then they can say, no, left, or, you guys are going away from me, or you're getting closer. So at least you have some way to get the person back in. We all have the automatic lights, strobes as well. So,
But
Jeff,
you gotta figure out a way. I mean, isn't the halyard clipped to the person? I mean, if you get them back to the boat, let's say it's blowing, 18, you're under sail, person falls over, you turn around, let's say you're going upwind, just to make it easy. You turn around, you spot them, you're going to try to, you drop the motor, you're trying to come up behind them.
No motor.
And now you got to get them into the boat. So that part, what are you thinking? It's 18, there's 5-foot waves.
And unfortunately, I think that person is going to be in the water for a while. I mean, because if it's windy, I mean, in my boat, and I don't know, Sean's actually practices more in higher winds, I think, than most people. But I think you're going to have to drop some sails. I mean, otherwise you're just going to be, too powered up. But I think it's going to come down to, seconds of timing. I mean, you got to come in, you got to grab the person before you start making leeway, and you got to figure out some way to hang on to that person. Then you got to figure out some way to get them on the boat.
So I think that every single one of your PFDs probably needs a loop or a ring front and back, so that you have an easy place to hook them on, and you're always going to have an extra halyard. If you're going downwind, you've got a jib halyard. If you're going upwind, you got the spinnaker halyard. You always got an extra halyard that you can use, or a screecher halyard, right? You just clip that halyard on. You got to have a long enough tail. That's one thing. The tail on these things got to be long enough so that you can go all the way out to the back corner, where the back corner of the float. You're laying on the net. The guy's right there. Maybe you have a carabiner or something so that you can reach and clip the person, and then run back to the winch, or hopefully there's somebody there who can start winching that person up.
Yeah, I think
so a couple things you'll want to look at as you do that. As I go around and do this practice with different boats, it's I find that most even cruising monohulls, their halyards are not long enough to go down to the water, even directly abeam of the mast. And I'm a racer, I get it. When it comes to the weight of the halyard, that extra 3 feet of halyard, might cause you to lose a race. So number one is make sure your halyards are long enough, whatever line you're taking is long enough to actually go not only down to the water, but if you're going off the stern, that's even further. But plus you got to go a couple feet underneath the water, because then another thing to think about is if the person is wearing an inflatable life jacket, those rings on their life jacket, on the harness, are now covered by the inflated life jacket. Right.
That's another reason not to use those stupid inflatable life jackets.
Well, it's a thing to think about. So who's going to be doing the
Just have to use the right ones.
Because if the person who's in the water, they're cold, they're probably hanging on to the railing with one hand. And if you hand them down a halyard shackle that takes 2 hands to clip, and then they're trying to clip it to themselves, that will be challenging. If it's you, you're leaning over the side, not only over the side, but you're got to reach a couple feet underneath the water. And you need to have 2 hands to attach it 2 feet under the water. So, play with those things, test those things on your boat. I'll shut up.
I will say
we use a snap hook by Sea Dog makes a larger one. We use a snap hook on the end of a boat hook to pick up a mooring buoy. And I haven't done it, but I see no reason why we couldn't also grab D-ring life jacket with a harness on it, and so that the person in the water doesn't have to try to fumble around to put that hook on the D-ring themselves. That's easier said than done in a rough seaway, but it seems like that would be one way to at least get the person attached to something on the boat.
You're talking about like a carabiner kind of deal?
Like a, yeah, there we go. Those
It's
do.
like, yeah, it's
So
like a carabiner. Yeah, this one here in the lower left corner. I have one of those attached to my boat hook, and I use it for grabbing a mooring buoy, but it could be just as effective at grabbing a D-ring on a life jacket.
Yeah, you know, and I guess that's one of the things that'd be great to practice is that, you know, what exactly are you going to grab hold of? And I want to do this as well, because, you know, when there's actually a person in the water, most life jackets, there's not really that much to grab onto, to hook onto.
Where Barbara
And if
Hall
it's,
works
an
also.
inflatable life jacket, getting that underneath it. So I've seen, so this is Rich Dumoulin from back east from the Cruising Club of America. He does this, that's what he does there on the bottom left. On the upper right, that's a hook and moor boat hook. You know, that actually threads a line through, it probably more cumbersome, but anyway, I just wanted to share a picture what that might look like.
Yeah, and I have to admit that the reason why my dog rescues and kid rescues were so easy, I think, is because the dog jackets and the kid jackets have those gigantic loops on them. You just reach over, you grab that loop, and you yank them in. So, I mean, I think having some, you know, if they're wearing something that has the ability to hook onto, that probably is the best. That makes sense to me anyway.
Margaret, just an idea on the short halyard issue that you raised earlier. If you had sort of a, I don't know, 8, 10, 15 foot pigtail with these type of carabiners on each end, you could quickly set up something to any halyard to get that extra distance you need. And you've still got room as long as it doesn't two block up the mast. You know, you've got, it's an option anyway. If you've got that handy on deck or in the cockpit, it's
Well,
an
that's a good idea, because the you could have it, you know, because the snap shackle on the end of a halyard isn't particularly great for trying to, you know, grab a, you know, it's a little fiddly thing.
Yeah, it takes two hands. Yeah.
Takes two hands, you know, et cetera. So yeah, your pigtail idea is kind of good, because then the person on deck puts on the snap shackle on this pigtail thing, and then it's got a great big old carabiner hooky thing on the working end. And if it was 20, even if it was 20 feet, because you know the Hounds, which is the lowest place, that's more than 20 feet above the deck on all of our boats.
I'm thinking the pigtail is to use the barber hauler. At least my barber hauler always has the hook on the end of it, right? And so now you got a hook to grab onto, which basically looks like what you're just looking at.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Double duty. It'd be nice. When I got my
Yeah, so
barber
you
hauler
use
has
the barber hauler, right? You know, you just pull them up and use that hook on it. Use it as the pigtail.
Another option would be floating like a polypropylene rope. And I think I was going to sign up for the Barefoot Raid up in BC one year, but it was canceled for COVID. But they require that you have a throw rope on the boat. I think that might be a Canadian kind of Coast Guard requirement.
So I was one of the things, there's so much I'd love to talk with you all about, especially so many of your racers. One of the things that I thought would be interesting to do, but I just dropped out for the sake of time, is looking at the list of required equipment, you know, that's required for the offshore and coastal races by World Sailing. And that is one of the things that World Sailing requires is a throw bag. I've got mine sitting here, you know, and I was wondering for many of you, like, if you have a boat that doesn't have railing, do you even carry a life sling, or do you all just like use a throw bag?
We actually have both on our boat.
Yeah, so do I.
Where do you keep the life sling so that it's handy on your truck?
We have a bar that's kind of right off the stern. It's basically hung right off a lifeline right at the stern of the boat at the back of the cockpit. Okay. You can almost see it out of my head, right? Right there.
No, Sean, that's not working.
No, right here. I think that's one thing that's kind of important here. Yes, there's a lot about getting somebody back on the boat, and it's going to be a unique thing for each boat. I think the biggest piece is getting back to the person. We kind of touched on it a couple times, but we found that with our boat, we did a little bit of practice with our crew before the around the county race, and we were able to get out in 15, 18, pushing 20 knots of wind. And we were single reefed with the full jib, and kind of right at the looking at putting a second reef in, for us at least. And we found that if we're in upwind mode, we're tacking. Our plan was to tack right away as soon as somebody fell over. That does a couple things. This kind of came from the race week discussions, but it puts an automatic mark on the chart plotter, whether you push the man overboard button or not. Just make a nice tack right there. Makes a point on the chart plotter to help mark it. Then we go and drop the jib right away because we're just going to be moving too fast. And then whether we sail back or motor back is kind of depending, but we're probably going to drop the motor and get it going to at least help us. And then when we get back to the person, ideally we're coming upwind next to them or pretty close to them. And then we have to drop the main, and not just all the way, not just down to, we have to pull the gaff batten down so that thing is down, tucked away all the way. Otherwise, in the kind of winds, our F-31 starting to move off at 2 knots, plus with no sails up. So we have to get that boat stopped, get it lying essentially across the wind, hove to, if you will, with no sails up. And then at that point, then we're looking at possibly, hopefully being close enough that we can either throw our throw bag or throw our life sling to the person and get them to the boat.
Unless you get possible to heave to with the sails up.
It won't do it. We hove to with sails up. We're doing 1.8 knots. And I beg you to try and hang on to somebody at 1.8 knots.
Swim fast.
You're not going to be able to
catch the boat. No way. Yeah.
Really, 1.8 and 2 knots is too much to hold on to somebody, huh?
You want to try it? Let's do it. I'll go out and be in the water. You can try and hang on to me.
You're too big.
He's too big.
I mean, holding on to somebody is going to help slow the boat down, but then you're trying to hang on to a sea anchor. And I think you're going to find that if you can get the boat stopped at a knot or less, then you have a chance of actually hanging on to somebody at the end of a rope. And this comes from, I've got a pretty substantial whitewater rafting background with swiftwater rescue experience. And I've been on the end of a line in a life jacket with a ring on my back. And I think I noticed I put something in the chat there. If you're going to get towed through current, you got to be pulled from behind. It's the only way you're going to survive. If you're pulled from the front, you're going to drown. Ideally, you don't want to be pulled at all, but yeah, there's lots of advantages to being pulled from behind if you're getting pulled.
Can you use a sea anchor to slow you down a little bit so you could leave your sails up?
I sure could, but I'm kind of looking at things that I've got ready to go, and if I got to start putting tethers on my or lanyards on my halyards and throwing out my seat, going down below and get my sea anchor and stuff, it's just I'm looking to get things done a little quicker than that, I guess. So what I want is stuff on board that I can do. And we actually did this with 3 people on board is when we were doing that practice. And you pretty much needed 1 person to drive, 1 person to drop sails. If you're doing it by yourselves, it's going to be a lot harder. We sailed 2 up.
Did you have somebody in the water?
No, we would take a float cushion and just throw that in the water to try and practice getting back to the boat.
Did you try, when you hove to, did you try using the motor to slow you down?
We could have, yeah. We could have tried that. That would have helped out. We were kind of trying a couple things, seeing if we could, hove to without having and do the whole thing without going to the motor. And we pretty much decided that if it's going to be that windy, we're dropping the sails and we're using the motor. And yeah, you could probably use the motor to help that. But ideally, when you get to the person, I don't want to have the motor in gear. I want to use the motor to get to the person and then put it in neutral. For the same thing Jeff pointed out is that I don't want that spinning prop back there. Ideally, the person's getting brought up by the side, which on our boat, luckily, is a long ways from the prop. But if the boat's still moving, they're going to move their way to the back of the boat eventually.
I've thought about putting a shroud around the prop on my little outboard just for that exact reason. What do you think about that?
Probably worth it. I mean, it's a pretty minimal thing for a big piece of safety, I think. But I think getting back to the person is going to be the biggest piece. Once you got the person, once you got a line of the person to the boat, then you can stop and take a breath. You got them connected to the boat. You can kind of reassess a little bit and go from there. And then you start figuring out how to get them on board.
What do you think, Sean, about based on your
fooling around with it, what do you think about this lanyard idea to a halyard to just get the person up?
If you don't have the length, yeah, that seems like a good idea. Our spinnaker halyard, which is kind of our go-to halyard because it comes back to our electric winch, we did make sure that it is long enough to get to the water in that regard and back to the winch. But our boat, the two, when Justin and I are out on it, our PFDs, yes, we go with the inflatable ones, but I went with the Spinlock 5Ds for a couple of reasons. One, they have the cross strap, they have the thing, and not only when it's inflated, it's got a nice big red line right here at the front. It's on the outside of the tube. It says lift here. Snap onto that, and it connects into the harness, and you can lift the whole person with that right there. So I think the proper kit, there's lots of PFDs that work good, and I get the idea of the non-inflating ones. We went with the inflating ones for a couple of different reasons, and I'm pretty comfortable with them. So
Does that fancy Spinlock thing have a place to lift from the back?
that is one of the things I don't like about it. Its tethering point is at the front.
We learned in cold water rescue class in the Ballard pool years ago that it's really difficult to climb out of the water onto the edge of the pool wearing a inflated life jacket because the inflated part of the jacket acts as a big bladder, two bladders on your chest that you're trying to get over the top of to get onto the side of the pool. And
the Mae West effect, yes.
So
it's like you're a large-busted woman.
Exactly, yeah, and I don't have much experience at that, so so it seems like getting onto a boat with an inflatable jacket is not going to be easy. So somebody pointed out that they don't like inflatable jackets, and that's another reason why they're not necessarily your best friend.
Yeah, you're essentially left with trying to have something assist you on board in that case because they are inflated and they take up a lot of space. It's true.
It still goes back to the idea of having a drop down or pull down swim deck that is only has to be a 2 foot by 1.5 foot size that can be lowered or pulled down if you're single handing. What I'm envisioning is when I'm single handing my boat, the first thing I do is look for ways to trim the sails so that I have a little bit of weather helm. My greatest fear is I'm going to fall overboard and the thing is going to sail off without me. So if I can trim the sails to begin with as a preventative measure, so I have just a little bit of weather helm, enough so the boat stops, so that I can at least swim to it, then I feel a lot more comfortable single handing.
We've had Spinlock by, am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, we've had Spinlock 5Ds inflate, and they don't take up that much room. I don't think it would prevent either of us from getting back aboard the boat. Almost all these life jacket PFD things have a tethering point in front. That's what you want when you're working on deck. You need a separate lifting strap or some kind of attachment on the back if you're going to tow somebody from the backside. I know the Spinlock 5Ds don't have that.
Diane, I just wanted to check in terms of timing. How much more time?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, our phone's running in here.
Diane, I just want to do a process check in terms of timing. How much more time do we have?
Oh,
all night.
Oh, another half hour or so.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. We do have a couple things in the chat we might want to get to. Let me see. There's a web link way at the beginning from experience that people at BC Multi-Hull Society had. Sorry about the noise. Yeah.
Gosh, shit.
Maybe Alec could tell us about what's at the web link and why we should look at that.
Sure, I could do that. It's a good article explaining what not to do when you fall overboard. So it's totally worth reading. Some of his conclusions at the end, I think he still doesn't quite realize how close he was. Well, I think he realized how close he was to dying, but still maybe not prepared to go and do all the safety things you should do to not fall overboard in the first place, and to wear a life jacket at all times when you're on deck.
Especially you can't swim.
And he couldn't swim very well, so definitely wear a life jacket. Almost everybody in the racing scene up here in BC wears inflatable, and on multi-hulls we generally seem to use ones that are not automatic inflation, because one of the problems is if you do flip over and you are inflated underneath the netting, it's a problem. I know Wayne Gorey had that problem in one of the Benal 360s when they flipped off of race rocks. One of the crew came up under the netting, but luckily was a really good swimmer and really comfortable in the water, was able to get himself out of there without drowning. So that's something to think about. So the inflatables have the advantage, you can stab yourself and deflate if you find yourself in that situation. Other than that, when I took the safety at sea course, the first rule was don't fall overboard in the first place. And a lot of your effort should be put into that. And then secondly, when you do fall overboard, then no points for beauty or kindness or anything else. Put a rope on them any old way you can. Put a noose on them and drag them up by the neck. In fact, the more pain you inflict, the less likely they are to do it again. And lastly, in racing, we've had a number of incidents. Cheeky Monkey was one where there was forced all sailing, F-31, downwind and 30 knots of wind going into Camp River. And the boat jibed, and Kim, the captain, and one of his crew were on the high side, which became the low side. They got swept off. The other two crews spun the boat around, sailed it back up, picked them up in 30 knots of wind and like big waves. And they lost first place, they came second. So with really good, well-trained crew, it's amazing what you can do. And also think on Dragonfly had the problem where once the netting gave way, which does happen, and fell down between the hulls and out the back. But again, on a well-crewed racing boat with everybody on deck, usually in the warmer weather conditions, warmer water, it's not a problem, or not a big problem.
Did they say how they got back to the person and how they managed to get him back on deck?
I think adrenaline probably something to do with it, and also they were all very. I think probably it was Morgan Tedrow took over the helm for that one. But we're talking about really competent sailors who are right on their game, and we as cruisers and so on, we can't count on that. We did have one member a long time ago off of Mexico that took a long walk off a short boat, and they were way off the coast, and he hadn't bothered to teach his wife how to do anything. She was desperately trying to figure out how to do whatever.
Get the motor working.
She finally got the sail down and finally got the motor working, but she went back and couldn't find him. So she went back to the shore, and the next day some fishermen was out there, and they found this guy floating around. So they picked him up and took him back into the shore. And when he got close enough to his wife that they could talk, he started yelling at her and blaming her for not picking him up. That was officially the end of his marriage. So falling overboard is bad for your marriage.
Yeah, understandable. Yeah.
But he did survive because it was warm water.
There's so many situations that can happen. It was before my time on the Hanson Rescue Medal Committee, but a number of years ago down in Southern California, there was a trimaran that had the skipper went overboard in a race, and the two crew sailed the boat back to him and they of the two crew each grabbed an arm and drug him up over the swim step. And they report, so Dave Lumian is a buddy of mine who was one of them, and he said that as they were pulling the guy up over the sugar scoop, that he was screaming at them not to, and they just drug him up anyway. It turns out when he'd fallen overboard, that he hung on to the spinnaker sheet, as we all do, right? You're flying the spinnaker, you're not going to let go of it. And he dislocated both his shoulders. And so that's why he was screaming when they just manhandled him up over the stern by pulling out his arms. So yeah, it's nice to have other options that, for a variety of reasons, other than just brute force to get somebody up on the boat.
Andy has a web link too. Do you want to look at that?
Well, I just put it up for a resource. It's a Yachting Monthly article where they have, looks like they have 6 or 8 different possibilities for getting someone onto the boat.
Do we have the ability to get once the Zoom's done, we don't have the ability to recover that link, right?
It's in the chat.
Yes, we do. Yes, we
Oh, it
do.
is. Okay.
The chat is also recorded, and I could, when I post the Zoom to the YouTube website, I could put the chat in the text below. So I'll do that.
Oh, great.
Maybe
Awesome.
maybe not the entire chat where we say goodnight and so on, but just the good web links.
Yeah, great. You know, we probably ought to talk a little bit about, we've been talking kind of a racing situation and all that. We probably ought to talk a little bit about the big cat people and, you know, how they view this. I mean, it seems a lot easier to me on a great big old catamaran. You have, you know, cranes and hoists and all kinds of different good stuff. But I don't know. I have no experience.
I think that's an excellent point. And then before I switch this off, just want to point out for those of you who are thinking about using the boom vang to get somebody on board the boat, you know, it's the nice thing about your trimarans without lifelines is that you don't have that obstruction. But for other people who do have lifelines, you got to make sure that you're not going to 2-block before you actually get the person over the lifelines. But yeah, I'd love to hear from the catamaran sailors.
Can I just say one more thing in terms of about using the boom vang on a trimaran, or not the vang, because I can easily unclip my main sheet from the Traveler, swing it out, and I've got and both the topping lift and the main sheet go to fairly powerful winches, so I can easily lift about 1,000 pounds just with the mechanical advantage. But I would have to disconnect the running backstays, but then I can swing the boom right out to the side. And with the preventers, I can actually lock it in position and control its swing quite easily from the cockpit.
And what type of boat was that?
That's on my 44-foot trimaran.
Okay,
I've never
I guess
had a
everybody's
chance
figured
to
it out.
try it.
So we have a 48-foot catamaran, and we have little steps on our rudders, actually, and a sloping transom with steps on it. So it's very easy for someone to grab a hold of the rails that go down the transom, step on the steps, and pull themselves up back aboard the boat. We do that all the time when we're swimming. It would be a little harder to do that in a man overboard situation if you're cold and unable to help yourself. Our strategy is to use the boom. We have preventers rigged on each side so that it's a quick thing to do, to use a 4-to-1 purchase to clip onto somebody in the water, pull them up over the transom, up or up over the side. We have gates in our lifelines that we can quickly remove or open up and hoist somebody up that way. The 4-to-1 purchase may or may not be enough, but it's not difficult to lead the preventer line to a winch and hoist somebody up that way. What we haven't done much of, we spent a lot of time getting back to things in the water. That's not an issue. We've got motors that are 25 feet apart. They're powerful motors, cruising catamaran. We could drop the sails basically instantly. They slide right down the mast. It's really quick. So maneuvering is not a problem. Getting back to a person in the water, if you know where they are, is not a problem. Getting them back aboard the boat is something we'll have to investigate. And we need to practice this. And I have told Sue that at some point I'm going to put on my immersion suit and jump over the side. And we'll see how that works. I'm not willing to do it in Puget Sound without some kind of heavy insulation. But I could float there a long time if I needed to while she gets things sorted out. That is the biggest thing I think we need to work on, is just practicing these maneuvers. We do have a life sling. It's mounted on a small rail right at the transom, along with a man overboard pole and recovery lights and all this kind of stuff that we have to have for offshore racing. I think, if I remember correctly, some of the instructions for the life sling are to put it in the water and drag it around in a tightening circle so that the person can get to it. Is that correct, Margaret?
Yes, basically like they're a water skier, towing the line to them.
Right.
The line, they put the life sling over them underneath their arms.
So, you know, in most of the conditions we've been in, the water's not that cold. You know, between here and Alaska, it certainly is, but in the tropics off of Mexico, it's been fine, and a person could probably be able to assist themselves, even climbing up over the transom with the rails and steps. We'd have to see about that. Our basic strategy goes back to staying on the boat, and that's our number one rule. In all the years we were fishing and going to Alaska, I told everybody who came on board that if they fell over, they were dead. It would be very hard to get somebody back on board the boat. In heavy weather, it's very hard to keep track of them. We're always shorthanded. It's just Sue and me. And if somebody falls over, you have to keep track of them while you're trying to do all this other stuff. And it doesn't sound like a very promising prospect to me. We have jack lines that keep us from going over the side. We have life lines, NWMA lifelines now, and that should be adequate for strength. But once again, we have jack lines that, even with my extended tethers, it's short enough to keep me from going over the side. We have jack lines underneath the boat as well. We just installed those. If you're tethered on and the boat flips, and we have not come close to that situation very often, the Spinlock PFDs have cutters that you could cut the tether with, which brought up an interesting point in this discussion. If you cut your tether to get free of the boat so that you can get out from underneath it, you don't have any way to clip onto the jack lines that are under the bridge deck.
Yeah, if you cut yourself.
Yeah, you know, that's an interesting, we'll have to think about that a little bit.
Yeah.
The other thing we've done, we read the account of dragonflies capsize, is to get manual conversions for our inflatables so that they don't automatically inflate. We have had them inflate just from spray in the cockpit, and it's sort of dramatic, but once again, if you've got your sticker thing, your cutter, you can deflate them to get back on the boat. So that's basically where we're at.
We have MLBs.
Yes, we do have personal locator beacons for each of us and the ditch bag. And when it's time to renew, I'm constantly renewing EPIRB registrations with NOAA.
Yeah.
Has anybody had any experience with an inflatable slide? Airlines have been using slides for years in the event of a water landing to allow passengers to leave the aircraft before it sinks. Has anyone had any experience with a mini version of a slide that could be deployed by suddenly inflating it, especially for a disabled or unconscious person, to get that person on board?
To use them as a ramp to drag the person up?
Exactly, to drag them up the slide.
I've not heard of that. No.
That's a little bit like what our transom is like, with a couple of bumps in it.
A slide with speed bumps, yeah.
You know, I see these things on, I don't know if it's like surf rescue, where they're pulling these inflated things behind the jet skis.
Yeah, I know what you
You
mean.
can probably get one of those, and it's got loops on it to hang on to and stuff. That could be something worth looking into.
Well, you know, the one thing that I've seen that's similar to that is that they sell ramps for people who own dogs to make it, you know, possible for the dog to get out of the water and up onto the boat. And I wonder if there might be something that's, you know, intended for Fido that might be modified.
All boats should have boarding ladders. And I think ABYC speaks to that, but anyway, you have a boarding ladder that is deep enough in the water that you can easily use it to get out by yourself.
Yeah. And for those of you who single hand, you know, one that you can, something you can deploy from the water.
A little different than Presto, being the cat that we were just discussing, is most modern cats have the props behind the rudders.
They do?
Yeah, so it's something you really need to know before you go out and charter a modern catamaran. Is 90% of them have the props behind the rudders. So you're up.
It's not enough to scare you. I don't know if you can you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
That's a shot of, yeah, exactly, a modern cruising catamaran, and you can see down here, there's the prop just looking at it from the dock. And so, yeah, for, you know, to make monohull sailors are kind of used to the props being deep and far away from the edge of the boat, and they're scary in the from the prospect of having a crew overboard near them.
One thing that is good about them is that you can park these things sideways and sail them backwards. They will go backwards to the wind. They will just catch the wind and almost like you're hove to on their own. But if you have that prop spin around there, you're just going to chop up your crew. So just something to know if you're chartering a boat and you can't see anybody when you're up, you know, in that little peekaboo area outside of above a patio roof, you know. You can't really see the transoms when you're up there at the helm. So just something to practice if you ever charter a boat like that.
You know, there are a few catamarans I've seen with that configuration, but very few. Almost all of the catamarans I've seen in and out of the water have the rudder aft of the propeller.
You know, a lot of what it has to do with is the size of the catamaran and the age of the catamaran. So you'll find a lot of catamarans in like the 40-foot-ish range, you know, 40 to 42, the size that most of us are going to charter, I'd say about half of them. You know, the lagoons will typically do that, FPs, and they put it aft because then they can put the engine. They don't have to have the engine sitting underneath the bunk in the aft cabins, you know, because if you've got a conventional prop shaft, you've got to be up there. So they move the engines to the stern, which is nice to get it out from underneath the aft bunks. But then the engines, even with the sail drive, are sitting there like this picture where they're aft of the rudder. So yeah, it's you'll see it this way fairly commonly. So it is a consideration.
So would those be pivoting drives on those, or just fixed?
No, they're fixed. They're just a sail drive.
Really? Because you know, I'm used to always having the opposite configuration, except on this boat where I have two non-steerable outboards either side of the main hull.
Yeah.
But
So obviously, so man overboard retrieval techniques from a monohull, you know, or excuse me, from a catamaran, obviously is pretty much you're got to pick them up from the stern. It's hard enough it's all but impossible to get on a modern cruising catamaran from the dock anywhere but the stern anyway, let alone
Yeah.
But you've really got to be careful about the risk of the prop strike. And another technique to play with for a cruising catamaran, if you're going upwind, is a heave to overboard rescue, augmented by the engine. So this is on a 40-foot lagoon. Person goes overboard. If you heave to immediately, and you've got to do it immediately, and the big challenge is, I think, for all of our multi-hulls, is you got to get the main out, right? If you're trying to heave to, if you're trying to bear away, if there's any sort of wind, getting the main out so that you can. But if you can get a catamaran, a cruising catamaran, quickly hove to, start your engines, and what you're doing is just using your engines to keep the boat upwind of the victim. In fact, you're using your engines in reverse. It's kind of counterintuitive, but as you know, our boats love to sail on their hull, catamaran or trimaran, and they'll sail forward on their hull if you let them. So you're using the engines in reverse just to stay upwind of the victim. And when you get close to the victim, stopping, actually turning off the engine closest to the victim, because those underwater meat grinders, and then making contact with the victim on the leeward side and bringing him up the swim step. So that's kind of something we do for the cruising cats. But it takes practice. But the advantage of this is that you make it back to the victim fairly quick. And part of the importance of that is you don't lose sight of them. But the downside is you've got to react quickly. You've got to practice enough that you can heave to quickly when it happens and get back. So.
Hey, Margaret,
Yeah.
I noticed you're using a boat hook. We haven't talked a lot about use of boat hooks. Everything is throw the guy a throw bag, do what do you think of, is a boat hook an important sort of man overboard type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, in that situation, it was using a boat hook to recover the buoy. But yeah, in terms of making contact with the victim, it's nice to have multiple tools with it. You saw how we looked at a couple examples of different boat hooks, but I think, yeah, having a boat hook to potentially hook the victim, like if they're injured or unconscious, to get them close enough to the boat that you could get a line around them or get a life sling around them. I know we're getting close to the bottom of the hour. I wanted to bring up another topic and see if there was any interest or any need in that the group saw in this. To quickly talk about, again, this research for what's called the Midline Lift. And this is something, kind of in a nutshell, it's something that is has a lot of interest, particularly among racers of high aspect ratio monohulls. I know performance monohulls with that narrow fin keel, that if somebody goes overboard and they slow down to try to pick the person up, and if it's windy and have big waves, which is when somebody oftentimes goes overboard, they have a heck of a time, controlling that boat close to the victim. And there have been documented situations where you bring the monohull up, upwind of the victim, which is what we traditionally teach for man overboard recovery, and the boat's just blown over the victim, and so the victim's pushed under the water. So as I talk about what it is, I'm curious if you all see any reason to explore this option for multi-hulls, because multi-hulls also have the issue of love to sail on their hulls, don't have a lot of underwater appendages to stop them from sliding sideways. So the way that basically the Midline Lift is a modified version of using the life sling. The idea is, and I know I skipped over the introduction of the life sling here, assuming you all are Pacific Northwest boaters, and of course you are familiar with the life sling. But if not, there's some great videos on my website on that link that Diane shared. But so the modification for the Midline Lift, the idea is that get the life sling to the person in what you throw the life sling to the person, they put it on them. But rather than being upwind of the victim and blowing down on the victim, you actually get the boat in a position where you're downwind of the victim, and you're pulling the victim to you. The advantage of that is that then you don't have the risk of the boat being blown over the victim, and particularly if it's a boat that has like a hard chine, where you've basically got a bottom underneath the boat that you could pound them with. That's an issue. So the way it's rigged is that you take the life sling line and you actually hook the halyard to the life sling retrieval line. So now you have a 1-to-2 ratio, and so you're hoisting the halyard and hoisting, for every foot that you raise or every 2 feet you raise the halyard, you're raising the life sling a foot out of the water. So perhaps rigging it with a low friction ring like this. So there's the halyard, there's a low friction ring, there's the life sling line, and the advantage. So what does it look like if you're the man overboard? So you've got the halyard led to the middle of the life sling retrieval line. And so what it's doing is it's pulling the victim towards the boat, lifting them, but there's not as much. One of the downsides is there's not as much mechanical advantage because it's 1-to-2. I've been doing research on that on multihulls. I'm going to be working with some of our racers, but the little light went on my head is like, well, what about for multihulls, which also have the issue of when they're slow, when you're slow, difficult controlling them, they love to slide sideways. Any thoughts?
I would think that the AMA would just bounce right over him and hit him in the head.
Could you go back?
Mm-hmm.
There's two parts of this. I mean, I get the lifting part, but the placement of the boat, is that a necessary part of this midline lift, or is that a separate thing?
It's not a necessary part of the midline lift, but it's kind of the reason for doing it. One of the big reasons for doing it is it lets you have the boat downwind of the victim and still bring the victim to the boat, but have that contact happen because you're pulling the victim to the boat as opposed to the boat being blown sideways or being pushed sideways by the waves and being pushed onto them.
So take Jeff's situation. He's out there trying to get back to the boat. He drops his, I don't know, well, shit, if he's in the race to Alaska, he's screwed because he doesn't have a motor, but.
He is, sorry.
Yeah. Let's say we're in a race where you can use a motor. You come around, you get behind, you get to leeward of the victim and then try to.
Well, no, actually, to be fair, and I apologize for my poor sense of humor to say that he'd be screwed in a race to Alaska. You could do it under sail. The same technique that you do with a traditional life sling is you throw the life sling behind the boat, you sail the boat in a circle until the line makes contact with the victim. When it makes contact with the victim, they put it on. You stop the boat, you get your sails down, but you're trying to maneuver your boat into a downwind position of the victim rather than upwind of the victim. An engine can help that, but I guess not essential.
So in your normal approach, you're trying to drift down onto the victim. In this new approach, you're trying to station yourself to the leeward of the victim and draw them to you, drag them through the water to you, and then lift them.
That's because the idea is the wind is going to have more effect on pushing the boat through the water than pushing the victim through the water. So I guess the advantage is it eliminates the probability that the boat is going to get pushed by the wind over the victim.
Exactly.
So,
I see. Is that it, Margaret? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
Okay, so let's think about.
So then we have to be very careful about the wind pushing the boat at a speed that it makes it too difficult to get the person back on board.
Right.
But if you have an attachment to that victim, then you can compensate for that by trimming the retrieval line.
Yeah, to a point till you run out of line. I guess you gotta have a strong enough motor to motor into the wind to hold station while you're dragging the person through the water to you. But so imagine, I guess you would attach the dead end of the life sling, like on my boat. I'd tie the dead, the whatever the end of the life sling on my pad eyes, throw it to the person, and then.
So you would throw the life sling to the person in the normal way, which is, this is a life sling bag. So one end of it is attached, and you've thrown it overboard, 150 feet of floating line. You've drug the life sling to the person. They've put it on, and the life sling has this floating polypropylene line.
Right.
And once they've made contact with it, and again, this low friction ring is optional, but basically what you've done is you've taken your halyard and you've attached your halyard to that life sling line. So as
don't you because the life with 150 feet of line, you need to somehow shorten up the life sling.
That is one of the exactly, and that is one of the challenges, or one of the factors to consider in this is that either you need to have shortened your life sling line ahead of time, and so rather than having a 150-foot life sling line, you've shortened it to whatever 75 feet, so that, because if you don't shorten it, you're gonna take your halyard to the top of the mast before you get the victim out of the water. If you've got a 75-foot mast, it doesn't work. So either you've shortened your life sling line to make that happen, but then you have the issue of it's a lot harder to drag a line that's only 75 feet long and make contact with the victim. For those of you who've practiced with a life sling, the longer the life sling line, the easier it is to bring it to somebody. So you've either permanently done that, or you've marked the life sling retrieval line with a mark on it somewhere, and you know that when you do this technique, you're going to have to take that life sling line and quickly cleat it down on a cleat somewhere on the boat to make it that shorter length. So that is a factor.
What would happen if you would just go ahead and tow it as normal? When they get it attached, you pull them in until you get to that line, then you cleat that line off, then you do the hoist.
So that is an option, and then they're suggesting you actually mark where that point is. You pull them in, you pull in the first 75 feet by hand, and then you cleat it down somewhere, and then attach the halyard and bring them in the rest of the way. Like so many of these things, the message that comes up over and over and over again is don't fall off the boat, always wear a life jacket, and you've got to practice this on your own boat. So that
I kind of like this midline lift idea. If you've got a I don't know, this what you have here is a ring. You could also have kind of a hook kind of thing with a a nice, or a snatch block.
Mm-hmm. A cheek block or something.
And then
the shackle itself would do fine.
It would. You could just take the halyard shackle down there. You'd have a little bit more friction than this frictionless prop, but it would still work. And part of it.
One thing I'd be tempted to do was, forget the whole idea of that, because that 1 to 2 mechanical advantage is actually a disadvantage. You're cutting your lifting power in half. What I'd be tempted to do is just pull the line in and then tie it off to the halyard, so you have the full amount of lift in the halyard. Mm-hmm. I mean, my halyard winches are strong enough, I can lift somebody to the masthead if I need to, but if I cut that mechanical advantage in half, they may not be.
Yeah, it's interesting.
When I first saw this, I understood it was to avoid all the rigging, any rigging at all. The only thing you have to do is snap that snap shackle on the near the end of the life sling line. No sweat, it's right there on the boat. You don't have to reach down, try and rig something onto the person, rig a 4-to-1 or anything.
Right.
It's just
that is definitely an advantage. And that's one of the reasons why the early, the people who are adopting this so far are the race boats with high aspect ratio. They don't handle at all. They handle very poorly when they're going slow, and they've got a bunch of deck apes, right? And they've got coffee grinders, so they don't really care. They put the deck apes to work and just pull them up. Or
1 to 2 is not too bad with some of those boats.
It's a mechanical disadvantage, but
yeah, exactly. It's a mechanic. I need to put advantage in quotation marks there.
I lifted Sean Hubline with our 40 to a 40 whatever winch, 40 power winch, and it's that's a real potential issue. What do you think, Sean? If you cut your winch power in half, would you be able to lift a guy?
I don't remember which speed you were using, of the 1-to-1 or the 2-to-1 version on your, on your winch. I don't remember which way you were going there, but just for reference, I'm a pretty stout 250, 6'3", and they were able to do it. It was working. It was slow, but I think if you were to make me twice as heavy, which is essentially what that's doing, it's going to be tough.
Yep.
That's something we ought to try, though. Just to see how much power we would need. Because you think if the person's 230 pounds dry, naked, what are they going to be with a bunch of, water in them? A bunch of clothes and a bunch of boots full of seawater. It's got to be another 30 pounds or something.
Easily.
Another thing on a try would be the amount of beam, because it's going to be a fairly sharp angle where that halyard goes over the side of the boat rather than on a narrow monohull. So you might be able to get the person up to deck level, but it's really hard to get them any higher.
You might consider, can the smallest person on your boat lift the heaviest person? If the heaviest person falls off.
Yeah, because that's a question that you should answer anytime. And for many couples, even with a conventionally rigged life sling with a 3-to-1 block and tackle, the smaller of the couple can't lift the heavier of the couple. So
Vince, you're gonna get that electric winch yet?
Yeah, exactly. Get that electric winch.
Your dreams.
Well, that might be the other situation where this 1 to 2 works as well, as if whoever the person was saying, yeah, I've got a couple power winches on the boat. Well, if you've got power winches on the boat, maybe this is more workable for that. Because I think it comes down to that power issue, where you're going to get it.
Yeah, this is just something we're going to have to explore and try out.
But even with electric winches, you still have the problem of the life sling being longer than the height of your mast.
Right, you'd still have to shorten this line. Either have it permanently shortened or mark it, and you've got to pull it in partway by hand and then know where to cleat it down.
Yeah, it seems like if you took
doable. The cleating it off seems to me doable. Shortening the life sling retrieval line. There are a number of cleats you could use, and you just stern cleat or whatever, and you haul the person in, cleat it off, put your snatch block on the retrieval line, and start cranking. That seems okay.
I would say permanently tie a trucker's hitch about 10 or 20 feet, whatever, back from the sling. You pull the guy in by hand, so he's somewhere near the boat, hook your halyard with a snap shackle into the trucker's loop, and pull him up straight, 1-to-1.
Then that's a 1-to-1. That's interesting. That's real interesting.
Because you're not going to be using you got to get him close to the boat first. You should be able to do that by hand.
Connection.
Margaret, what do you think about that idea?
I'm trying to picture it, and honestly, I don't know if I'm picturing the same thing. Let's say there's a trucker's loop that's tied 10 feet above this, where the line is on this cleat. Well, you've got the problem. You're not going to be able to.
No, 10 feet from the 10 feet from the sling.
From the victim.
But actually what you'd want to do is tie it 10 feet. That allows you to, say I have a 50-foot mast, so I tie it 40 feet from the sling. So I have enough to, so I have enough to get the person out of the water without two blocking it, but still as much line as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I think I might have missed part of the beginning of this. What was exactly the problem we were trying to solve here by using this 1 to 2 mechanical advantage on it doesn't handle? Is it just this works better to have the boat to leeward or to windward or to leeward of the victim?
The key problem they're trying to solve here is the issue of, yeah, when in high winds and big seas, especially if you're a performance boat or, you know, a boat that has high aspect ratio keel, and you tend to go downwind quickly and not be able to control the boat to avoid having the boat hit the victim. And
okay, so and the boat is drifting away from the person and you're trying to pull a person to the boat. You're using this aspect so you can pull in a lot of line by pulling in, because you're going to pull in twice as much line by pulling up the halyard in this scenario. So you get into the boat quicker. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, so what it does by lifting, as you're lifting, you're actually pulling the person towards the boat as well as lift. You know, when you get close,
Right.
you'll be lifting out of the water. But while the victim is away from the boat, you're using this to pull the victim towards the boat.
I see. I guess I'm struggling to see. So if you circle around, I mean, they've got the line to the life sling, and yeah, so they're probably out there a good, you know, our life sling line is pretty long. They might be 100 feet away from the boat, but they're on the end of the line. You got 100 feet of line to pull in to get them to the boat. So I could see where, you know, you're using your halyard and mechanical and that advantage of that regard to pull the line in quicker. I could see that if it's not going to work, that you can't pull them in by hand. You need something to help pull that in. I can see this for that purpose.
Yeah. Or
once they're to the boat, this is in fact a disadvantage to actually lifting them because of the mechanical setup.
Yes.
We just put a figure 8 in the life sling line and attach our halyard at that point, and then pull up the halyard to pull up the life sling in a 1-to-1 ratio.
You caught up, Sean.
Am I caught up?
Yeah, you caught up to the discussion. That's basically where we got to.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just making sure I was.
Yeah,
on board here.
I like the idea of whoever came up with that idea of putting the trucker's hitch or figure 8 hitch, you know, 8 or 10 feet. So you bring you haul the person to you by hand, get them close, and then instead of having to lean over and kind of trying to reach down into the water to give the person the halyard clip and to get them clipped on while the float's bouncing up and down and all this kind of crap, you get to the loop, you bring them in till you got to the loop, attach the halyard and whoop, pop them on up using the 1-to-1. I mean, I like that a lot.
yeah, well,
that solves a problem.
And Sean's electric winch.
That is basically the traditional life sling recovery technique, though, because the life sling has, and I'm sorry, I tried to keep this presentation short, so I took a lot of the detail out in terms of the pictures, but
Okay.
the life sling has a loop tied in it. And so when you do a conventional life sling recovery, you get the person to the side of the boat, and that loop you've tied high enough so you can easily reach it from the deck without having to reach over, and you clip your halyard into that. Or the block and tackle if you're using the block and tackle, and then lift them up that way.
These race boats have enough halyards. You can do both. You can use one halyard to bring them in, and then another halyard to lift them once they're close.
I've never thought about that. Yeah.
One thing we haven't talked about is the use of a dinghy in recovery or rescue, I should say, of a victim in the water. And most cruising boats, whether they're multi-hulls or whatever they are, have some kind of a dinghy. And, you know, it seems to me that if it were possible to pull a person into a dinghy, especially an inflatable, which has got soft sides on it, then you're half the way there, getting a person at least out of the water.
Yeah, and so that is definitely a technique that's used, as, as an option, is that intermediate step. Of course, it kind of requires probably not something you're going to do if you're a double-handed crew and one's gone over, because now somebody has to get the dinghy in the water, get in the dinghy, detach from the main boat. But if you have enough people, yeah, it can be an intermediate step, especially if you have a boat with a lot of freeboard.
Yeah, but anybody, to play the devil's advocate, anybody who's ever gotten in and out of a dinghy knows that the dinghy is going to go in all crazy directions just as soon as you put your weight into it. It's a squirrely affair.
It'll be doing that in any kind of seaway anyway.
Especially in a seaway.
Margaret, back to your comment about doing this with the victim to windward of the boat. I know specifically on a trimaran, I would highly suggest not to do that, because in that state, when the boat's hove to, that windward flow is out of the water or nearly out of the water. And as you pull the person to the boat,
you're pulling them to the high side.
Whereas on the leeward side, if you're bringing them up on the leeward side, that leeward float is pressed into the water and is not usually coming out of the water with the waves. I would definitely not want to get picked up on the windward side of a trimaran. I would let go and swim to the other side.
Yeah.
It depends whether or not you have sails up. If your sails are down, or in my case, I drop the main and then continue maneuvering under jib alone because I have a head sail driven boat, and then furl the jib. But
yeah, even with 15 knots of wind with no sails up, our windward float is in and out of the water.
And if there's a bunch of waves, that windward float could be, just banging down on top of somebody's head for sure. Yeah, I don't like that idea.
But if you're pulling him towards the leeward side and his legs go underneath it, or half his body does, because the boat's drifting down on him, he's still going to get pounded down.
Yeah, but not as bad. I mean, lesser of two evils.
You'll just have to try it and practice and see how it works.
See who survives.
Well, I think that's it. Is we got to try it and practice and see what's going to work. So and I know Diane is probably going to speaking of hooks and boats, Diane's probably going to reach a hook out towards my neck here any moment to say that we need to wrap things up. So one thing that I just want to put out there is that I would love to be involved with anybody who wants to do research in this in terms of the real world on multi-hulls, especially because while I think there's been, we do this somewhat regularly with the cruising catamaran. I don't really know anybody who's done a lot of structured research on this for a trimaran. I do have access to a dummy, a life-size dummy that I can make about 130 pounds. I was going to say a realistic weight. Well, we're Americans. I don't know how many of us still weigh 130 pounds, but realistic-ish weight. And happy to go out if somebody wants to in a structured manner and try some of these things. So I'll just leave with that invitation.